Heather, who's behind the scenes, to push the record button to make sure that we're recording. That would be great. I want to make sure before we continue that that's done. Okay, we're all set. I got the word that we're all set. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The State of Journalism 2020, and it's brought to you by ACE's Writing and Media Relations Learning Community. I'm Lori Greiner, and I'm the Learning Community Director for ACE, and I'll be your host. Craig Woods, our Professional Development Director, will also be helping us monitor the chat today, and I'd like to thank Heather Brown for helping us on the tech side of things. We're going to ask that you all put your questions in the chat or wait until the end of Gregory's presentation, but you can go ahead and start adding them there, and Craig will monitor those. But I'd like to welcome you, and I'm glad you all come today. We have a real treat. Our presenter today is Gregory Gallant. He's the co-founder and CEO of Muckrack, a digital PR and journalism platform. He's also the co-creator and executive producer of the Shorty Awards, honoring the best social media. Previously, Greg was an associate producer at CNN, where he analyzed the latest trends in citizens media. A lifelong entrepreneur, Greg has founded an award-winning web development firm at age 14. He's a mentor in the Techstars Startup Accelerator. Business Week named him one of the best young tech entrepreneurs. Greg's a frequent speaker on social media, marketing, PR, entrepreneurship, and journalism. He's given presentations at South by Southwest, La Web, Harvard Business School, and the International Journalism Festival. His columns have appeared in Fortune, Forbes, and Business Insider. Greg's also a member of Twitter's exclusive First Name Club, and you can follow him at Gregory. So at this time, I'd like to welcome Greg, and I will stop sharing and turn it over to him.
Great, thanks so much, Lori, and really appreciate you all having me and taking this time out of your day. I know everyone's, even working remotely keeps us busier than ever, and as communicators, it's a lot to deal with. But I'm really excited to share this research, and as mentioned, throw your questions into the chat, and I'll either get to them throughout the conversation, or more likely at the end. And I guess we can, maybe even make it interactive towards the end and take the questions live that way. And yeah, I really want to make it as much of a conversation as possible. And can everyone see my screen? You just got a thumbs up. Great. Yeah, really excited to present this research. So just, a bit of background. I co-founded Muckrack about 10 years ago. It's grown into a fully featured PR software platform. We also have a lot of tools for journalists that we offer them for free to be able to maintain their portfolios, do research, etc. And so every year for the past several years, we've done this survey of how journalists use social media and like to be pitched. And that's what I'm excited to present to you today. So first, we wanted to delve into how they're using social media. And this was an interesting stat we found. And I hear this question a lot from PR pros, which is, should I follow journalists on social media? Or, will they see that as kind of, crass or off? And we find, overwhelmingly journalists want to get more followers. They like it when PR pros follow them on social, and we'll talk about which platforms in a minute. So highly encourage you to follow them and engage with them on social media, which I'll talk about more soon. We also asked them which social network's most valuable to them. And this I find really fascinating, since most people would probably say their most professional social network is LinkedIn, or maybe Facebook, or if they're a teen, they'd say Instagram or TikTok. but journalists just love Twitter. They're on it all day. You know, there's this whole idea of media Twitter. So it's kind of hard to understate that even if your ultimate consumer for the company you represent isn't largely on Twitter, the journalists are. So if your job is to reach journalists, Twitter is really the place to be. And what's interesting is Facebook's number 2, but if you look at the trends on where things are going, you can see that this is showing you where journalists are planning on spending more or less time. So even though Twitter is number 1, they're planning on spending even more time. This green, the 38% of them said they're going to spend more time. 46% said no difference, the yellow, and then in red, only 15% said they were going to try to cut their Twitter addiction. Whereas Facebook, you can see they're moving away from Facebook on the whole. They're moving towards LinkedIn, though, to a lesser degree. They're moving towards Instagram. A good number of people are moving towards Reddit, though it's still pretty small. Same with YouTube and a little bit TikTok, too. So I think the big takeaway here, in general, Twitter is just getting bigger, and then start paying attention to LinkedIn and Instagram, too. This is a really interesting stat where in probably about the past 5 years, it's emerged that journalists can track how many times their stories are shared. And you can too. We have free tools in Muck Rack that can let you do that, and there are a few other ways. And it's kind of revolutionary when you think about it, because there used to not be a public metric to know how much engagement a story got. Even if you got a story in the New York Times, you had no way to know how many people turned to page 7 to read that story, or how many people told their friend about the story. So it's a powerful metric, and many people in PR track it. What's interesting here is the journalists do too, and I actually suspect more journalists that admit to it are tracking their social shares, because for a lot of them, the amount of engagement their stories get can, in some extreme circumstances, determine their compensation. But in many cases, it leads to, hey, which journalist is going to get the front page placement, or get the raise, or the promotion, et cetera. This is another interesting one where we saw journalists are checking companies' social media accounts when reporting on them. And I think this kind of flips how you have to think about social media, and kind of in a broader company-wide sense, where a lot of companies leave social media more to the marketing department and only think of it as a tool to reach their consumers or customers. But social media serves another purpose, which is journalists are going to check it and use it as something they consider when writing about you or not. So you might want to consider working with the marketing team, making sure that what you're putting on social media is also going to be useful to journalists. Or we see some organizations do that are very consumer focused is set up separate accounts for the media. One great example is our customer MasterCard, where they have @MasterCard, and obviously their number one priority are the millions and millions of people that have MasterCards. But then they also created @MasterCard News that's solely run by the PR team for the express purpose of reaching journalists. Another one, kind of going back to the idea of journalists thinking about shares, what makes them think a story is shareable? The number one thing is, can it be connected to a trending story? And it's important to note, we actually did this survey before COVID, and now I think we're seeing, with COVID, it's kind of like you can't connect your story to COVID in some way. For the most part, you're probably not going to get written about. But that's just part of a long trend I think we've seen, that journalists are thinking about the big trends out there. And if you pitch them in a void without knowing, hey, what are the big stories, maybe overall or in your industry that your client can connect to, then it's a harder pitch. Second is just that the story contains an image, and this makes a lot of sense. And it's been a really radical change on the web, where 10 years ago, most news stories didn't have photos on them. But now, especially due to the rise of social networks, where if you share a story, it pulls the image, almost every news story has an image on it. So I think in the PR world, we have to think more about when we send out a pitch, maybe the initial pitch doesn't need the photo attached, but pointing to, hey, will this have a compelling photo at some point? Or can you make an infographic if it doesn't lend itself to the photo, or create some kind of image so that the journalist has a lot more to work with. Now I wanted to find out what's the best way to pitch a journalist. And we found out this, I thought was bad news for anyone who's not a morning person like myself, but journalists like to be pitched in the morning. Most of them, before noon, and half of that group even earlier, before 9 a.m. And this is whatever time zone they're localized in. So, you really have to pay attention to where the journalist is based. But it makes a lot of sense. It varies a bit by journalist, obviously, but if you don't know anything else about the journalist beat, in the morning they wake up and they figure like, hey, I got to figure out what to write about today. And by the afternoon, they're more struggling to complete their stories and finish their deadlines. We also wanted to find out which day of the week matters the most. So most journalists actually didn't have a preference, but of those that did, it was overwhelmingly early in the week. 20% on Monday, 10% on Tuesday. And again, I suspect this follows the same trend as why journalists like to be pitched early. Early in the week, people are setting the agenda. Late in the week, they're just trying to meet deadlines. So again, if you don't know anything else about the journalist, then your story has flexibility, good to pitch early in the week. And also, of course, you probably want your story to run earlier in the week, assuming it's good news, because you'll generally get more traction with it. And if it was bad news, pitch it on Friday, because they probably won't look. And then if they do write about it, it's part of the Friday news dump. We asked how many pitches journalists receive. We were actually kind of surprised by this, that more journalists didn't receive more pitches, but then we found talking to journalists, I think it really distributes where there are a lot of journalists that are the ones that get pitched the most and then fall into that 20+ range with the 13%. But we find, despite this, overwhelmingly journalists are getting lots and lots of pitches. This was interesting to us. We wanted to know how long the pitches should be. And we found that most, a lot of people get trained with the idea that you write 500 words, you answer the 5 W's, and then that should be your pitch also, and have it contain everything. Whereas we find the most effective pitches, and this is confirmed by journalists, are short, either 2 to 3 paragraphs, which 61% want, or just 2 to 3 sentences, as 31% want. And only 8% of them want something 3 paragraphs or more. So it really pays to keep it short in your pitch. And I think the way to think about the pitch is more that you're just trying to get the person interested, because journalists love to ask questions. So you want to get them interested, excited in your story, and then they can follow up with you and ask all the questions. But you don't necessarily have to give it to them all in that first pitch, especially because they're very pressed for time and they're not going to have time to go through every little piece. We find that the journalists, they really span the frequency of what they write. And I think the internet has only increased this, where you can see 44% of journalists write more than 5 stories a week, so more than 1 a day. And then there's 16% that just write 1, more kind of feature-y type stories. And then you can see, it distributes pretty well over that. But, roughly, if you think about it, half of them are writing less than a story a day, half of them are writing a story a day or more. So it really pays to do your research on the journalist. If you go to their Muck Rack page, you can see how frequently they're being published. And that really affects your strategy, because if you want to pitch, let's say, a smaller announcement, one of your customers, your company is making, it's probably not going to work if the journalist writes 1 feature piece every 2 weeks. They're going to want a much bigger story. Whereas if you see it's a journalist who's, pumping out 2 or 3 online articles a day, they're probably very hungry for news, much more likely to take your exclusive. So, a lot of this stuff comes back to you got to really know the particular journalist you're pitching. But these aggregate stats kind of give you an idea of where the journalist is likely to lie and how broad the distribution is. We found 50% of journalists found that a quarter of what they write originates from pitches. So you can see, a good amount of these stories are originating from pitches. Only 28% said none of their stories originate from pitches. So I think it goes to show pitching the press works. It's not like they're mostly just writing what they're going to write, regardless of if you pitch them or not. And we asked why a journalist would reject an otherwise relevant pitch. And this kind of goes back to the point I was making before. Lack of personalization is the number one reason. So if you're sending the exact same announcement email to a bunch of journalists, the journalists know that. They can figure out like, hey, this is generic enough. It probably went to a bunch of other people. And they ignore it both because there's a feeling that if you didn't put a lot of time into it, why should they give you a lot of time? And also then I think they know that it was probably sent to a bunch of other journalists, so it's less likely to be exclusive to them. And now that everything's available to everyone instantly on the web, the journalists prize having unique stories more than ever. So it really pays to personalize it. Number 2 is bad timing, which I think is interesting. I had those slides before about time of day and when in the week to send it. I think it's also should be a bit encouraging that if journalists aren't biting, it might not be that the story you're pitching isn't newsworthy or that your pitch is bad. It might well just be that, hey, that journalist is working on some other big story or they're getting ready to go on vacation. So, it should be a bit heartening to the idea that while you want to personalize and put effort into every pitch, you still want to pitch more than 1 or 2 journalists because it might just be bad timing outside of your control. And then again, too lengthy, like we talked about, and confusing subject line. Here's another encouraging slide. A lot of people, you send a pitch to a journalist, and I'm sure it's never happened to any of you, but there's some PR pros out there where the journalist doesn't respond to your pitch. And then you have to wonder, does that mean that they've read the pitch carefully and have decided to reject it and will be really pissed if I follow up? Or were they just busy that day and it got buried and it'd actually be helpful to them if I followed up? So most journalists are good with a follow-up. 55% are good with 1 follow-up. 27% are good with 2 follow-ups. There's 5% good with 3 and 3% good with 4 or more follow-ups. Only 10% of journalists said they don't want any follow-ups. So that means 90% of journalists are okay with at least 1 follow-up. And I think that's really powerful. We found it too in our pitching where we send a pitch to a journalist, they don't respond, and we just ping them a week later if it's not pressing or if it is a couple days later and just say, hey, did you get my email? Sometimes we'll then add in another factor or 2 that have emerged since about the story we're pitching, and it really ups their response rate. So I'd encourage you to do that. And if you're using software like Muck Rack, we actually enable that right in the tool so you can track who's opened your email and then automatically send follow-ups to the people that haven't after the right amount of time. And then we asked how long to wait. 51% said 3 to 7 days. 32% said just 1 to 2 days. Only 12% said 1 to 2 weeks. So, I think this goes to show you can follow up pretty quickly with the journalists if they don't respond. And it makes sense, we're all in the news game here, the journalists and us. So if you're waiting too long, it probably means it wasn't news to begin with. So again, don't be shy. Of course, this is all predicated on the idea that the pitch to begin with was a good pitch, and thoughtful and personalized. Here we asked who journals consider credible sources. Number one was academic subject matter experts. And again, we did this pre-COVID, but I think we're seeing this really play out right now that they're looking for those sources. Number two, and this is good news for me, CEOs they thought were very credible. Up next were company PR professionals, followed by agency PR professionals, and so way ahead of bloggers or celebrities or social media personalities. So, again, I think pretty encouraging for the communications profession. We also asked how the journalists want to receive pitches. So at the beginning, I told you it's good to follow the journalists on social, engage with them on social. But that doesn't mean you should pitch them on social. Far and away, they want one-to-one emails, way ahead of mass emails and news wires, way ahead of the phone. And not to mention now, of course, most people aren't coming to their office. So if you just have their desk line, the phone won't work anyhow. Only 15% want it on Twitter. So, it's kind of delicate with Twitter, and there is some nuance around that. What I would say is, if you're checking out a journalist, follow them on Twitter before you email them if possible, and ideally long before so it doesn't seem too transactional. And you can look at their Twitter bio, which is also pulled into their Muck Rack page. And they'll often say, like, DM me by Twitter if they want DMs by Twitter. So I'd say, that 15% you see there largely self-identifies. The other nuance is you can only you never want to publicly reply a pitch to a journalist, because then other people will see it and it's not exclusive and other journalists will see it. So the only way to do it on Twitter is with a direct message. You can only direct message a journalist if they follow you, or if the journalist turned on a special setting in Twitter to allow anyone to direct message them. So this cuts home to that idea why it's really important to do the relationship building on Twitter first, because you build a relationship with them on Twitter first, then and they follow you, then you can definitely direct message them. Otherwise, it's a bit of a crapshoot. And I always feel better about doing things over Twitter if I built a relationship. And going back to that point on following up, the way that we'll usually do it, if it's a journalist that we know well, we'll send them the pitch by email. If they don't respond by email, I'll send them a direct message then. This is assuming I know them and we follow each other. I'll be like, hey, I know it's been a crazy news week. We sent you an email on Monday, just checking if you got it. And then that's when they'll often be like, oh yeah, I was so busy on Monday that I just searched for it and found it. I'll reply now. So I find that's where it's good to use multiple mediums in the relationship with journalists. But again, all predicated on the idea that you first put the work into doing great journalist identification, a great pitch, and also have built these great relationships ahead of time. Then what we want to know, and I'm sure we've all had this, where you get a great win, you pitch something and the journalist writes about it, and then you want to keep up that relationship with the journalist. So we found on the flip side, 40% of journalists are good with email. This next stat I'm about to share, of course, pre-COVID, but 25% were good meeting in person. Maybe now they're good meeting 6 feet apart in person. But still a good number who will meet you in person, 25% on Twitter, 23% on LinkedIn, 21% by phone. Only 9% went out of their way saying they'd rather not develop these relationships, but 91% are not opposed to it. So I think it's always good to keep up the relationship. Email is easiest, just to drop notes here and there. And then I'd say, just look into the journalists, if they're near you. If you see that they tweet, they're going out a lot to coffee and bars, like ask them out for a drink or a cup of coffee. If you see that they're constantly, when you go to the Twitter page, you can then click on tweets and replies and see who they're sending tweets back and forth with. If you see they're corresponding with lots of PR people, great sign that you can really engage them on Twitter. And same, you can get a sense of how active they are on LinkedIn, and remember back to when you were pitching them on the story and think about how excited they were to get on the phone. We also found about half the journalists thought the way companies share information with media is now outdated. It's a pretty broad question, but I think it's a good sign that a lot of companies can really stand to shake things up and try new ways to correspond with the media, moving away from mass distribution more to much more targeted distribution, and really be a lot more thoughtful about the process. We also found that, again, I think very heartening that most journalists thought that their relationship with PR people are mutually beneficial, but not quite a partnership. But I think that's what we should all want, because journalists learn in journalism school that they're there to serve their readers, not the people they cover. 7% did think it was a partnership. Another kind of heartening thing I thought is that there's 14% where they said it's antagonistic, but that it's not inherently a bad thing. So you do have a PR person, a journalist giving you a hard time, they might just be doing it because they feel that's their job and it's nothing personal. So you can comfort yourself with that. And you got to know there is 15% of journalists out there who consider it all unnecessary evil. So that's why all of our employers and clients need us, right? Because there are some really tough journalists out there, and you have to manage those situations. Another interesting thing we saw, journalists on the whole, despite all the challenges in this industry, are optimistic about the profession. And, so for takeaways, I think I called these things out, so I'll just leave this slide up here for a couple if anyone wants to jot anything down. But, I think the overall theme is, really be thoughtful about how you pitch, really customize it. Another thing I've always found is that the folks like yourselves who are in associations and take time out of your day to stay fresh, there's probably a lot of stuff in here that you already know, but there might be people on your team or bosses who aren't in PR or clients who don't get this stuff and maybe want to send out mass pitches or send really long pitches or do things that are counterproductive. So oftentimes using these stats can be a really powerful method to go to those folks who aren't up on the latest trends and really prove to them like, hey, it's not just me saying we should do this. There's a survey and, you can see in aggregate, this is what journalists want and what they don't want. So, I encourage you to use all these statistics when you battle for budgets or ways to change processes in your department, et cetera. And with that, happy to take any questions now. And you can always find me on Instagram and Twitter. My handle is @Gregory, or just email me, greg@muckrack.com.
Well, thank you, Greg. This is very, very interesting. I just have a couple, to start off, I have a couple questions. Is this something you do periodic? How often do you conduct this survey? Is it yearly?
Yeah, we do it every year.
And how many people do you survey?
It's I don't know the exact number offhand, but it's thousands of journalists.
Okay, great. And so if you were to look back, what is something that you've seen change? Is there something that you've seen change drastically, let's say in the last 5-10 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like the level of tracking journalists do on their own stories, like that used to be something really rare and only a few outlets would do, and it's become quite common now that journalists do it. It also used to be kind of looked down upon, like the startups would do it, like Business Insider and Gawker and the New York Times, Wall Street Journal thought that was kind of unconscionable. And now everybody does it. It's just a new standard of journalists thinking about their own audience development. And then also seeing journalists, and there's a trend we've seen play out, but the journalists think more and more about their own personal brand, where they used to really see themselves as like, my brand is the New York Times, and I just write a column, and I'm happy if I get a story on the cover once a year. And now they're much more thinking like, hey, I'm people know me as a journalist. I care about building my brand. I got to build my followership. I've got to build my audience. I've got to get book deals. Who knows how long I'll be at this publication? So I need my followers to go elsewhere. So, seeing them pay a lot more attention to their social.
Okay.
And by the way, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see all of you at once.
Sounds good. So there are a few questions in the chat. I think you've answered a couple of them, but one of the questions was, how did you actually distribute the survey? Was it like electronic, or like how did you actually distribute the survey?
Yeah, we did it electronically by email. We emailed many journalists and invited them, all types of journalists.
Great. And let's see what else is here. So did you see any differences between print and maybe broadcast journalists?
That's a good question.
Separate those out?
Yeah, we haven't dug that deep into the data yet, but I can tell you, anecdotally, like the timing can be very different between print and broadcast in terms of like when they're getting on social, what they're doing. They're both very much into using social media as we can just, as is apparent to anybody. If anything, the broadcast folks are sometimes even a little more on top of it with social. So we've seen that, but then with broadcast, it depends a lot, with a lot of local affiliates, they're a lot further behind in terms of digital, kind of the digital transformation. Whereas, in print, it's been pretty far down the road that it was kind of digital or die for a few years now. A lot of local broadcast affiliates have been able to make it work just fine, at least up until now, by just doing their broadcasts on their websites aren't great, as I'm sure many of you know, and it might be really hard to find, even find a clip on a broadcast website. So we see, there's this kind of digital divide, but I think that's going to really play out. The broadcasters will have to figure out the digital game in the next few years as just the current trends of online consumption continue.
Yeah, things are kind of going really fast, especially these days. Sherry has a question. Can you see that? It's kind of a long question. She says, I understand journalists saying how they would like to be contacted. Did you also ask them how they actually respond? In other words, ask what they do in addition to asking what their preferences are.
Got it. So kind of how, Sherry, I guess you're asking how journalists are like responding, or how journalists are responding to these pitches. We didn't ask them in the survey, but I'm out there talking to journalists all the time, so I can kind of address it anecdotally. We find there's kind of a split between journalists where some of them are like, hey, if you send me a good pitch, I'll at least give you a no. I have found a lot of journalists have said that they're reticent to even give the no because they've had a lot of experiences where they say no and a reason why, and then they get pressed for a follow-up or whatever, and then they get annoyed by that and don't want to open the door. So, if you do get ignored, just keep in mind, it might be through no fault of your own, but that just, they've had bad experiences with others that have turned them off to it, or they're just busy. As unfortunate as it is, because it'd make all of our lives a lot better if they just said no and the reason why, so we knew how to target our pitching going forward. So that's one big thing that we've seen. We find when they're interested, it's usually a quick couple line email just asking for more details, or sometimes jumping on the phone. We see again that there's a big difference between some journalists love getting on the phone, some of them hate it. So a lot of it is you have to kind of learn the journalist's preferences.
I don't see any more Well, let's see. I asked about demographics because there is a perceived age breakdown for when and how journalists like to be pitched. Do you factor in how
You know,
old they are or how long they've been in
yeah,
the
that's a great question. We do
business?
collect the demographics. I edited down the slide to fit in our time, so I don't have it off the top of my head, but if anyone emails me, I can share the data. I will say, I think that's a good point. Like, I find, I don't like to draw too many categorizations. We could see this a bit in the data, is that it tends to be the older journalists that are more comfortable with, and I think this is true not just of journalists, but more comfortable with phone calls. And then in general, you look at the generation of people in their 20s now, and they're just not very much into phone calls. They grew up texting, and now even in the workplace, they kind of go into using Slack and all that. And many of them at younger publications don't even have desk phones. And I think that's another thing to consider too, is not just the age of the journalist, but the age of the publication. So New York Times has a switchboard, you can call it. And I mean, it won't work now because they're all working from home due to COVID. But in other times, like the switchboard would have actually potentially gotten at least the phone to ring at the desk that the journalist is at. Whether or not they pick it up is another story. Yet at Vox or BuzzFeed, like, you set up your newsroom over the last 5 or 10 years, you're not going to hire a receptionist. You're not going to invest in a fancy phone system when you know that that you have a digital first staff, many of whom are probably working from home or out and about, and that everyone's relying on Slack as their primary mode of communication. So I think you really have to kind of consider all those angles. One thing I will say too is I encourage everyone to think about using a CRM. There's sales CRMs like Salesforce and HubSpot, or one thing we're doing at Muckrack is we're building a CRM into Muckrack so that with every journalist, you can take notes on them and save it to their profile. Because it's really important, like with each journalist, to learn all this about them and find out, like, oh, this journalist loves to talk on the phone. They hate getting quotes by email. They're old school and they'll keep on the phone for an hour because they just like talking. And this other journalist, I had to fight to get on the phone with, and they couldn't wait to get off. They just want the quote by email. So, really learning and recording the preferences of each journalist really matters.
So, Greg, this kind of leads to another question. How do you see this pandemic and how we're working today? How is that going to change things? When you do this, what would you expect when you do the survey this time next year? What are people going to say that they're doing differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think the pandemic's going to change a lot, both for journalists and for PR pros. I think it's going to push digital first even more. I think the idea, of course, print was already going out, but the idea of getting, at a time when people are wiping down, cardboard boxes that they get. I can't imagine people are going to be that excited to be getting newspapers delivered in the kind of post-pandemic world. I think for journalists too, it's going to push them more to be digital first. I think one big thing will be what we're doing right now, Zoom. Like 2 months ago, it was really rare to jump on a video call with someone, especially someone you don't know. Like the idea of like being like, hey, we were just introduced by email. Want to hop on a video call and talk about something? You'd never do that. It just felt really weird. And if you said, let's hop on a Zoom, half the people would be like, what's a Zoom? And Google Hangouts was always kind of, it's been around for a while, but really kind of a weird platform. And now it's totally acceptable. You get on these video calls all the time. I've done 2 video calls on Zoom with journalists that both cover our beat and have written about us in past in the last couple of weeks that would have otherwise probably have been coffee meetings. So I think that's going to be here to stay, is the idea that like video meetings are acceptable. And honestly, I think it's, obviously the pandemic's awful, and I'm here in New York, which is hit harder than anywhere. But I think the outcome of video calls being acceptable is great, because, save a lot of time and travel. It's good for the environment. Like we can now, it's like you develop a much better connection with somebody over a video call than you do over a phone call. And yet, you don't have to fly. If you're not in a big media town, you don't have to fly to do a bunch of desk side meetings every quarter to every major city that journalists that cover you are in. And, even here in New York, like I was just talking with a journalist who lives in the East Village, it would have taken me 20 minutes to get down there. And honestly, I never mind going to the East Village, but, that's still 40 minutes of my day that I save not schlepping across town to do a meeting and then, spend the time waiting in line to buy the coffee and all that. It's a really good meeting. So I think this could really potentially up a lot of our efficiencies in building these relationships and just a new style that we have to work into our cadence of relationship building with like saying, hey, do you want to hop on a Zoom?
Great. Does anybody else have any questions before I ask another one? You can open your mic or put it in the chat. Anybody at all? I do would like to bring up that many of our members, most of us, the majority of us work at colleges and universities across the country. And we work with faculty to try to get their stories out there. Very academic. I like the slide where people prefer academic information, but I also find
you control the most credible sources in the media.
But I do find that sometimes we don't do a good enough job of presenting that information to the journalist. It's either too technical, our faculty members want to provide all the stuff, and we probably tend to confuse the journalist more than we do selling the story. So do you have any tips on how to make that simpler, or how we can present maybe a really complicated topic simpler for journalists?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing I think could be really powerful is either challenging the professors or challenging whoever it is on your team that works to, write their message, rewrite it in something palatable to journalists, is to enforce the character limit. I mean, I think Twitter did a great thing for, as much as Twitter is criticized for many things, I think they did a great thing for writers out there, and that they forced 140 character limit for so long, and then now it's 280, but still relatively short. I found a million times myself, I've gone to write a tweet with an idea, and my first draft comes out to like 200 characters, so I work it down to 140. And by the time I'm done, I'm like, oh, you know what, actually, not only is the 140 version shorter, it's actually better because I spent more time and I had to edit it more. It's like that old line, and have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one. So I think, as much as possible, like, force your team, force the professors, tell them like, hey, we cannot send the journalists a pitch more than 4 sentences, or, maybe even back that out to a character limit. I don't know what that would be. Let's say can't be more than 400 characters, just so they can't get around that with a run-on sentence. Be like, it has to be 400 characters. You can't say to that, I'm not going to pitch it. And then that's like really a powerful forcing function. I've even done that with a lot of our junior staff, where when we hire people and they're getting ready to send out pitches and emails, they'll send me a draft and they send me some long thing. And I used to actually try to edit it down for them, and show them the red lines. And then I realized like I was wasting my time. So what I started doing with them is I would just tell them like, I'm not even gonna, I look at their pitch, I see it's like way too long. And I just tell them like, I'm not even going to read the rest of it or edit it. I just want you to save that, then make a version of it that's half the length. And afterwards we can look at both of them and you tell me if there's any reason to have done the one that's double the length. And most of the time they come back like, oh yeah, half the length was, a lot better than the original. And even then I'll often cut down the half length version. So, just anything you can to enforce brevity is really powerful. Another tactic you might use, and I realize like how delicate it is with academics and what a tough position you're in because you're not their bosses and if they have tenure, like they probably feel like they know everything. But I think maybe pushing them to explain it, explain it to their mother or father, or someone in their life who's not in their niche academic field, or just kind of creating that barrier and just really getting to them this idea that, like, hey, the journalist is here. The journalist is not a scientist or an academic subject matter expert. That's why they need you, and they need to translate it to the general public. So we've got to work hard to make this something that you would tell someone you just met at a cocktail party, not something that is the absolute best representation of the meaning of your research.
Great. Those are great suggestions. Yes?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. Chris Branham put it in the comments, a question of saying that I find that trade pubs like news releases more than pitches. They may not have the staff to write a story, so they want something in post right to their site. I'm curious as to, with the smaller newsrooms, do you see a trend in newspapers or media using more of the stories, the actual stories that you send them now?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of reports like that, and yeah, again, more like under-resourced trade publications or very local papers. Of course, a national paper or magazine would probably would never do that. But I do think that's starting to happen, especially as these guys are getting under-resourced. And what I would do in those situations is make your pitch really, like, what you can do is still make a very short pitch at the top, and then say, if you're interested in the news release, I pasted it in below my email signature for you. That way the pitch is short, so they can read it really fast and know, hey, is this something that I care about or not? But then still know that you actually have a real news release there, and it's so if they are in that spot where they're in a tight spot and they need to just copy and paste it. And I know sometimes you have to send out the news release because, I don't know, maybe it's a public. Probably not. Maybe not the same in the university case, but we know there are public companies that want to do a certain level of distribution, or something just so timely, or they're in a crisis and they just need to get the release out with all the stats. So yeah, in that case, I would kind of go for that format, like short pitch, full release below the signature. And I generally recommend just pasting in the release rather than attaching a Word file, because you never know with these corporate email systems that some news outlets use. They might not let them open it, or some people might be afraid to open it due to a virus, their compatibility issues, all that. So pasting it in could be good. You could also say, you could also always mention, like, hey, if you want this in another format, let me know. Or if you also put it on the web somewhere, then you can just send the short pitch and be like, by the way, it's here on the web.
Does anybody else have any questions? You guys are quiet today.
So I'll go ahead and jump in, even though I've already been in the chat. This is Chris from Oregon. Gregory, I'm at Oregon State University. And so we are seeing the effects of we already had been seeing the effects of the economy on local and our mid-size and large newspapers. So they are tending more to the small newspapers. Always have been sort of, you send them a release, they post it right to their website, or they may just run it in their print edition. Really, the only people I consistently pitch to are our NPR affiliate in Portland, which is kind of like the almost the state's NPR affiliate. We have an NPR affiliate in Eugene, and our we have an agricultural newspaper called Capital Press, which covers 3 states. All the rest, I send very localized news tips, but I'm finding that they really want releases more than pitches, because they just don't have the staffs anymore to write stories. It's pretty sad, but they just don't.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting trend, and thanks for sharing that. I think it's definitely a changing, news ecosystem that we're seeing. I'm curious too, for you, or if it's something that you thought about, like, does it change how you write the news release? Because I know, news releases used to be written maybe in a more formal way, with the intent that they'd be rewritten by the journalists, versus if it's going to run verbatim. I imagine, might mean that there's more incentive to write the news release kind of with the direct reader in mind.
Can anybody comment on that?
I don't really do it any differently, and I'm a recovering journalist. So I pretty much do it the same way as if I were working there.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's a good way to good mentality to have when you're writing them.
I'm a former TV news reporter, and I will do a short pitch before I do the news, the press release. And oftentimes I will cater the press release to the place that I'm pitching, because sometimes, whether it's print or broadcast, there are different formats. So.
Interesting. So it's not just one press release you're sending to everybody. It's
right.
Find out they're interested, then you tailor it.
Right. My biggest challenge, though, is getting my leadership to understand that all of these big words and these technical phrases can't be placed in emails, and sometimes I'm overridden on that, and I don't know how to handle that. The scientists and the dean, and they want to put these phrases that I'm reading it and I don't even know what they're talking about, but they're like, it has to be in the release. And I'm like, so.
Yeah. Well, I wonder there if you can separate the release from the pitch. You can have, or it sounds like you're already tailoring it, but you could have the official release that you get the dean to okay, and then you could have the actual pitch that you email to people that could be more catered. Of course, don't take career advice from me, because I've never worked for anybody else.
It's a challenge, but thank you.
Hey, we'll take maybe one or two more questions if y'all have any. I guess seeing none. Craig, we have a survey. Yes. Oh, you're already ahead of me. You've already put it in the chat. So please take a moment to copy that URL down and it'll take you 2 minutes to fill out this quick little survey about today's webinar, to provide us feedback and maybe some ideas for some future webinars. So please take a moment to do that. I'd like to thank our speaker today. I appreciate Greg taking time out of his busy day to talk with us. There's a lot of good information that he shared with us today. I'd also encourage you all, if you're not familiar with Muckrack, to take a peek at his stuff, his business, and reach out to him if you have any questions about how he might be able to help you in what you're doing. So please feel free to do that. And with that, I guess we're through for today. Again, thank you, Greg, for your time. I know Lori wanted to be here, but she had a family emergency. So I do appreciate you participating today.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for having me. And thanks to everybody for taking the time out of their day and for all the great questions. Really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot too. So thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Bye, everybody.